Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Are we starting now? Are we going? Okay. Welcome to Building Healthy Multilingual Relationships, or How to Correctly Nest Entities in Drupal 8 and beyond. Oops, my name is Amy Hannaford. I'm the owner and architect of Spatial Path. I was a previous CEO and co-founder of Hook 42, and I've been working with Drupal for years in the multilingual web space for years.
And I'm Cristian Lopez, Peñasquito on Drupal.org. I work as a software developer at Linkotech, where I'm exposed on a daily basis with translating Drupal. And I've been a contributor to the Drupal Multilingual Initiative.
We want to really thank DrupalCon Europe 2020 organizers, the global Drupal multilingual team that's been working for years on improving Drupal multilingual, and Pantheon for allowing such nice testing environments, Lingotech, of course, and Hook 42 for the use of some of its cute image assets and doodles. So a little bit about this presentation. We're going to be primarily focused on Drupal 8 because we can't really cover everything, but these techniques can cover 8+, so things on from 8. And it's a really complex topic. So we're going to focus on content entities, but we aren't going to be covering the Acquia Site Studio or Cohesion because that's a whole different thing. So we're going to make sure that we can cover configurations patterns that you can use on your site, even though every site is different. Here we go. Note, the session is recorded and the presentation deck will be shared. So we're not gonna just read the slides, and we might go a little bit fast because we're covering a lot of topics. And we wanna cover the slides quickly to allow time for questions. So you might feel like you're drinking from a fire hose of data. But why are we really here? We're really here because maybe you'll have an English or another language site that you've done and it looks great, everybody is happy, and then the customer or yourself is like, let's add Spanish, let's add another language. And you're like, okay, how does that work? Did I prepare my site in a multilingual way to add another language? And sorry, so Drupal is a powerful platform, and there are a lot of moving parts to make a functional website. It's feature rich, extensible, flexible, and also multilingual first. But in reality, a lot of times, how you actually do that, how you actually use Drupal and your power is can add a different reality. So we want to prevent unhappiness of our customer and ourselves with clear expectations and to provide a predictable functional website. Because with great flexibility comes complexity. And there's so many different site building approaches. The content editing interfaces are different. So many things you can be doing at the display and theme later. So there's a lot of things going on here and so many different systems you can integrate with Drupal. And everything is changing so quickly. So there's so many permutations that you need to take a moment and say, okay, how can I make a really long lasting multilingual site? And when you add multilingual support, it exponentially increases your test cases and complexity. So this topic sneaks up on a lot of folks. They don't know that how much more time you have to spend to test additional languages and different workflows. So where there is great power, there is great responsibility, and this is true. So let's get started, and we're gonna talk about understanding multilingual content and site strategy.
So the first thing that we want to identify if we want to translate our site or to localize our site. So these are two different concepts. Translation is the process of changing the language of some text, of some words from one language to another. But the localization also involves adapting. So it's not only about changing the language, but it's also about meeting the cultural references or the specific target market of a given locale. Here we can see, like, for example, the stop traffic sign has been translated in Brazil. So this is only about changing the text in the sign, but it's the same shape, the same colors and everything. Localization, it's a different thing. So for example, in Spain, there are multiple signs for beware of wild animals, and they change on the context of the wild animals that live around the area. So in this way, we need to distinguish between symmetrical and asymmetrical translations. And for example, with layouts or paragraphs, this is something that we will see and we will cover deeply next. But the concept is that symmetrical paragraphs or symmetrical content means that every content is referencing the same content, but just translated, while asymmetrical means that you can reference different contents or different layouts or wherever you are referencing from the different translations. So each of them will look differently.
And as you get started with your complex multilingual site, you have to really figure out what you're trying to build. And so when you start with your project or you jump into an existing one, you want to use a realistic language first approach through all of your discovery and your requirements. And you want to cover some key topics. So how many resources do you have and how much resources, like budget and time, what your markets, your target markets are through language, locale, and translation expectations. You want to understand the purpose of your site, so that defines your content types and products and use cases and frequency of updates. And also your interface, you have to take multilingual into account when you do design and UI of the site, and include all locales, especially for large languages and right to left languages. And then also you really need to make sure that within your creation workflows, you take multilingual into account. And also in Drupal, we have storage. So your per field content needs, how are those going to live in Drupal itself? And you have to define some display expectations. And this is where a lot of people get surprised. So first of all, you want to make sure you ask, is the whole page structure the same across languages, or does any region of the page's structure change per locale? And does the page structure change drastically across locales? And the big thing that captures people by surprise is, does any part of the content need to change per locale? So a lot of times people say, no, the content needs to be the same. The layout is the same. Let's just keep it the same per each language locale. And what happens is, in reality, is that the page content is 90% the same as the source language, but then 10% of the page has locale specific content. So even though you have just 10% or a small amount of difference on the page, you do need to account for that in your architecture. You also want, when you address your content creation system, all the people and tools, who updates the content, who translates the content, how much control does each editor have for copy and layout? What are the responsibilities that the translators have? You know, are you using an external translation management system? And then how and when does the content change per locale? And the one that most folks in the Drupal community will see is what is the proposed Drupal layout approach? Because many agencies or developers might have their default approach that they use. Are they reference nodes? Are they paragraphs? Are they layout builder, custom blocks? This is a really important thing, because if you come in with your predefined layout approach coming into a site, you need to know how to work with that. And then when we get into content storage on field planning, you must ask questions for each field of a content entity. And does the content stay the same for each language? Do the values stay the same but need to be translated? And does the field content contain translated or language specific information? And also, how are you displaying that content? So all of these questions are very important, and we'll cover why later. The big challenges in the discovery phase is education about multilingual and the full team involvement. Sometimes later in the projects, multilingual issues will arise and it'll catch people by surprise. So very early, please define what translation and localization mean to you in the project. Define the life cycle of every type of content, including the multilingual platform and translation. Teach everyone about some of the multilingual basics, and really document everything in beyond your basic architecture and planning. And also, don't forget about media. Media is a challenging, maybe a challenging experience working with multilingual websites. And if you plan to fail, then you are planning to fail. So make sure you plan.
So we are going to see some fundamentals about multilingual and nesting content. But first, let's look at Drupal itself. So the nice thing about Drupal for multilingual websites, and which makes Drupal probably the best competitor in the CMS market for multilingual sites, is that Drupal 8 was built with a language-first approach. So the Drupal community learned a lot about the problems that this brought in Drupal 7 and previous versions. And in Drupal 8, everything was reworked. So content entities are language aware, and there are ways to define the fallback rules, and every entity API or every API in Drupal has language into account. And it includes modules that allows you to build a consistent multilingual system. So in reality, there are a lot of things that come into play. So you have to be really careful when configuring everything. Like there's language detection from your browser, language fallback in case some translations doesn't exist. You have to take into account how you display and theme your content. And sometimes there are customizations that are making their own assumptions about the language. There are a lot of extensions from Contrib that may be or not be adapted to multilingual sites, your own customizations, and we said, and how people interact with editing interfaces themselves. So Drupal 8 was built in 4 multilingual pillars. The first of them is language, which provides the way to assign a language to a given content or configuration. And it has all the base services for dealing with that data. And it's not only for multilingual sites, also for monolingual sites that are not the default English. Then we have the interface component, which is for translating the strings that appear on your screen. Then we have content translations, which allows you to translate all your content in a consistent manner, no matter of the type of that content. And then we have config translation, which allows you to translate your configuration, like your blocks, your views, your field settings. and it provides a unified translation interface for all of them. So what this includes is language, detect language negotiation, the list of available languages, the way of providing custom languages and handling URLs for those language negotiation. Then we have the interface that provides theme, text, layout, and user interface, content, translation, which handles every kind of content that you have on your site, and config translations, as I said, for your views, your roles, your URLs, or your blogs.
Right, and as we get into, oops, sorry, Christian, I jumped in early. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So anyway, the content entities are a focus, and there are many like nodes, taxonomy terms, media, custom blocks. And as we look at content entities, there are three main kind of these fundamentals that go with content entities. Content entities can be translated or not translated, one or the other. Content entities have language display fallback rules if a translation doesn't exist. And content entities have fields that can be translated if desired. So a node can have a text field that can be translated if desired. If a content entity must be configured for translation if any fields within the content entity need to be translated. So if you have a content type of basic page, that basic page content type needs to be marked for translation to expose any fields within the content entity. And then each field can be configured for translation only if the content bundle is configured. A field can be one of two types. It can contain content, or it can point to another content entity, like an entity relationship, or even a concrete revision, like an entity reference revision. So it's simpler. It's simpler than it may seem up front. So you have three basic properties of a field, two types of fields. And here's some content fields versus reference fields. So, and you'll recognize these as you build your Drupal site. So when a little bit of a rule, when a field is translated, the field's value can change across locales. If a field is not translated, the value stays the same across locales. That's very simple. And that rule applies to every field and every nesting depth. So as you get into the field level configurations, sorry, Christian, I'll pop the, don't just mark every field as translatable on your site, because it can cause confusion to the content team, because your configuration actually conveys what your purpose is with that translation. And if it's a text field or list that's used to define layout, like a CSS color or a class, don't translate it, because your code might not expect that in translation. Also, field constraints. Make sure that you take into account character limits and required status. And then when you reuse fields across content bundles, and make sure you address global configurations, because a field used in one content bundle that's translated with applying the field to another translation, you might expect some translation support there. But if the parent content entity is not yet marked for translation, you may run into some confusion. So let's see. Some content field multilingual configurations. If you have translated content, the text field, the source could be green in English. Translation in Spanish is verde. I did not pronounce that very well, pardon that. So the content for Spanish, expected behavior, will be a translation of the English source. A translation of Spanish must exist to display in Spanish. And if no Spanish translation exists, content is displayed using fallback rules. So this may sound very basic, and it may sound very obvious, but this, if you don't apply this rule around your configuration and properties in your multilingual site, you might run into unexpected multilingual behavior. So Christian, do you want to take this one? Do you want to talk about the entity field translation?
Yeah, so with entity references, if you don't translate your entity reference, everything is going to point to the same entity. So in the first case in the left, you have your content that it's a translation for the English in Spanish. The parent entity will display the Spanish versions of those entities if those translations exist. And if they don't exist, the language fallback rules will apply. In the second example, when you translate your entity reference, you can have completely different content referenced. So for English, you can have product variant 1 and 2, and for Spanish, you can have 3 and 4. You can even have different number of references, so you could have a different one. And the translations also need to exist for the target language. So if those didn't exist, you will see the language fallback rules apply too.
Yeah, and widgets are really important. So field widgets are used to render the field inside the forms, and they are a plugin. And why is this important? It's really important because some widgets alter the data model on form save and any other form interactions. And sometimes there's a bug. Widgets that alter nested entities can lose track of the language of its parent entity, especially if you have multiple depths of language or multiple depths of entities. So some samples of widgets are inline entity form, client-side hierarchical select, and entity browser, and asymmetric paragraphs. And nesting is to include one or more content entities within another content entity, either by an entity reference field or something like an entity browser. And all multilingual content bundle and field level configuration expectations apply for each nested entity bundle. So take all those basics we just talked about and apply to nesting. And this is really important. Plan, test a lot. Don't assume anything. Revisit and test again and then translate. But even after you do all of the planning and testing, you may run into some common issues with multilingual sites. So dealing with some common issues in your configurations is why is the wrong language showing? You have to check if your translations are configured correctly, check again. And you have to go very deep for your configuration checks. Check for field reuse and check for the existence of translations and permissions and publish state. Wow, there's a lot of stuff that happens here. And then also, why is the wrong language showing? You might have bugs. And we talked a little bit about the widgets that manipulate content during editing, and also the nested entities don't get the correct language. So some common issues of core plus config plus customization all working together to not display your language is that people use content choices and display logic to drive multilingual display beyond what's provided in core. So this is your display layer customizations. So each language specific display customization can cause unexpected results or bugs. And so you want to look at views, display logic, any display logic or language logic at the theme layer, and logic driven by content fields like locale choosers, and many site building permutations, edge cases exist. And one of the most interesting things that we've seen is that people will use a very specific field that's just text that will say, hey, this is what my let my paragraph be shown on these languages, and they'll select the language, and that they'll use the theme and a twig logic to say, oh, please just display the content in this paragraph for this locale. So they add their own multilingual support around their content. So this does happen, and some of those things are workarounds of some systems of some parts of Drupal that just weren't yet figured out yet. These are early adopters. And then another issue that people run into is decreased site performance. So complexity impacts page performance. Also, the high number of loaded entities per rendered page, if you're going to nest a lot of things. Also, multiple revisions stored on each edit causes a large DB size. And this is an exponential thing. So if you have a large number of revisions in storage and you have a large number of language locales, your revisions multiply exponentially, and then also by revision frequency. So this is why at the beginning you need to really address those questions of how often are you updating your work and how are you going to store your content. And Christian, what is the first rule of entity nesting?
Don't nest if you can avoid it.
And everybody's like, what? How can we not do that? What's the second rule?
So the second will be don't use a data model for layout.
And the third rule?
It's keeping it simple and consistent.
Yeah. Okay. Do you want to talk about this, Christian? I know we're a little bit off track of going back and forth, but okay.
So which entities are the worst nesting offenders, or the ones that usually can come with biggest issues? Is paragraphs, node references, block references, or any custom content entities? And the issue here is the second rule that we saw previously, is that we didn't have, so usually people is using this kind of solutions and nesting for solving the problem of the layout of content. And the reason is that when Drupal 8 was launched, there was no solution for that, for controlling the layouts aside of the theme. So I think Layout Builder came on 8.4, something like that, and people had already decided for these different solutions. So is there any hope? Yes, because Layout Builder, as far as I've seen, works quite well, and it's quite fast to use, but there are still a lot of sites that were built using different solutions. So this is one of example, is you have your node, your articles, and then you have a first level of nesting where you have a paragraph that defines the layout. So it's some kind of container, and it defines, if we all may be familiar with these 3 columns paragraphs type, where you define your layout in that paragraph. And then you have a nested paragraph that decides, that has the actual data that we want to show, which may be 2 text and 1 image. And that image is a reference to a different media entity. And this media entity is referencing a file, the image itself, which, even if we may be not aware of that, because that's an internal thing for the Drupal image field, is a different entity reference. So you have like 5 nesting entities here, and any problem with the language configuration there can cause some trouble.
And this is another example, and you can just see that there is one more level of nesting here. And this is a common use case where you will have add another product page node off a landing page node. And so it's adding one more depth level of complexity. So as we see these deep level nesting cases, each one of those levels has a content entity that needs to be aware of the proper language of what the content is, and what each and it's parent content, because you need to know, hey, I'm in Spanish for the landing page node, and I must make sure that everything that is embedded in that all displays correctly with Spanish. And when you work with the other entities, the field should follow the same multilingual configuration basics. So the questions to ask yourself for configuring translatability is the nested reference different between locales? Is the nested entity reused somewhere else? And is the nested entity used on its own? Like, can it be navigated to like a newsletter block or something? So this also, all these rules applies to headless sites using Drupal as a backend as well. All right, so we did look at some common nesting examples. We'll just do this really quickly. Is a single entity reference node with a taxonomy term entity reference. This is the most common. You have to ask the questions about what is the taxonomy field used for? So if it's used for displays, don't translate the terms, because your developers on the theme level might be using that term as a class. Only translate the entity reference if you want to display the change per locale. Also, is the taxonomy used for content categorization? So are you saying that my flower is a rose? So if this taxonomy field is used for content categorization, you want to create the taxonomy terms and translate them as a separate workflow, because the entity reference field is not translated, because the content itself doesn't change, just the translation is the same, or just the translation changes per locale. Then also, is the taxonomy field used for free-form tagging and user-generated content? Well, consider not translating the terms, and consider also how are you displaying that term or the best configuration for that type of content. And that's a whole different talk, or 4 talks. So here's an example of a single entity reference, and a couple of them. This is a node with taxonomy term entity reference. So in the top one, we have a taxonomy example. The top term is not translated. So you see in English, blue, green, not translated, and small. And in Spanish, you see azul, that looks great. Verde looks great. And not translated one, that looks like there's a bug. Why is it not showing in Spanish? And also small. This is a bug because the taxonomy term is not translated. So you have to go back and pipe your taxonomy terms through a translation process. So the not translated one can become whatever it is in Spanish. So if we look at the bottom, the term ER is translated. Now this is when the entity reference field is translated. So we're expecting that the values can change per language or per locale. So in English, we have yellow, large, and not translated too. And in Spanish, we see yellow and it's properly translated. This is great. We also see small, and I'm like, well, small doesn't match large. We assume that in the content they chose a different taxonomy term because they can, but also that taxonomy term has not been translated and it is using the fallback language sample. So English was the fallback language, so it's displaying small, and also non-translated is the same thing. So I think this might address some examples for content entity language display fallback rules. So this is the most simple. It just gets, and when I say it gets more complex as you move on, it's just because the nesting and layers of customizations come into play. So, and then we talked a little bit about the entity reference field widgets. So repeat this process for each content element, because this example quickly surfaces how you see reference translation exist, but you could apply this to all of your levels of configuration. So we're going to talk a little bit about complex nesting. Okay, and okay, go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, so as we briefly talked before, for translating, we want to use symmetrical solutions. And for localizing, you want to use asymmetrical ones. And concretely for layouts, if you want to have the same layout for different nodes, you need to use a country module, which is the layout symmetrical translation. And that allows you to translate the labels, to translate your layout. But if you really want to have different layouts for your content for each of the translations, you need to use the asymmetrical translation method, which is supported by the layout asymmetrical translation widgets module. And for paragraphs, there is a similar solution. So the paragraphs module doesn't support translation by itself and doesn't plan to do it. So, and actually when you configure the module, it shows this warning where it says that you shouldn't enable those paragraphs. So if you want to have different paragraphs per translation, per locale, you need to install the paragraphs asymmetric translation widgets, which may not be obvious, but it says that you actually need to enable the field for translation, even if paragraphs is saying not to do that. So this can make you fall in quite difficult bugs to debug. So it's important to take this into account.
Yeah, and go ahead. And as you get into the single entity reference, like a node with paragraphs, so we're assuming the node uses entity reference revisions to support the reference of paragraphs or a specific version for a paragraph. And the paragraph's goal was to provide flexible structure of content, but it's not conceived as a layout tool. And Kristen, go into a little bit deeper for the translations.
Yeah, and actually this answers a question we had about an example of widgets that were actually altering the data. So the asymmetrical, the paragraph asymmetrical is one of the widgets that does that, because it's actually a workaround for the widget for creating a translation for the widget when the widget responsibility shouldn't be that. So that's the examples we were talking. So if you don't have this module, do not enable the entity reference revision field for paragraphs, because the paragraphs module assumes that every paragraph will be the same and only will show the translated data in that paragraph. But if you are using the asymmetrical module, then you need to mark those as translatable. So in this example, we have a node where we have just a single level paragraph. So there's no deep in there. It's just one level of nesting. And we have 2 paragraphs for 2 events that we are showing here. But then we are translating this into Spanish. And for Spanish, we want to show different events. So in this case, we will mark this entity reference revision field as translatable. So in the next page, we have 3. Instead of referencing 2 paragraphs, we are referencing the same 2 paragraphs, but we translated them. And we added a 3rd one where we actually, like if this is an event site where we are listing all the Drupal events. So for example, for Spanish in Spain, we want to list also the Spanish Drupal camp.
Okay, and let's go into the layout builder, and we see your questions. I think we'll be able to cover some of these. So layout builder basics, for those who haven't played with it. It's provided in core. It provides a user interface for layout configuration. It stores your block and layout information in the content entity itself. Okay, and that is really important to understand because paragraphs are set, are stored in their own paragraph entity, and their own, each one has a different revision. So when we talk a little bit about what's the difference between Layout Builder and paragraphs, a lot of it is data modeling in the back end and also tools that can use in the front end. So custom blocks, when you use Layout Builder, are non-reusable blocks. So you can't just take a section of a page and use it somewhere. So that means they only exist within the scope of the content entity, and that means also the language expectations are around that bundle of the content entity. So you can do two things with Layout Builder. You can have a default display structure, and you define default display structures within a view mode. So you can engage Layout Builder here on one of your view modes, and then it looks, oh, I did that twice. That's very thorough. And then you can see this is Unami. You can see in the article content, you can add a default block to your display, and that will show up on all content elements. And then you can, and when you use this method, the content entities and fields follow all translation rules. If a translation exists and the field is displayed, the field displays the correct language. And now the use of reusable custom blocks will follow the same basic blocks pattern. And when you use reusable custom blocks, you should probably have a separate workflow that translates blocks separately because they're used in a lot of different places. So you can also use Layout Builder for entity level overrides. So what does that mean? It means that you can do per each content entity, like a node or a block, you can create your own cool layout using the layout tools. So for example, this is what happens to have each content to have its layout customized. This is a recipe on Unami's sample site. And I just inserted a basic block for English, and that will only show up on this recipe because I chose to insert this. So also, if only the fields in the content entity are used, because you get that Layout Builder surfaces fields, then the translated language should be okay as long as you translate all those fields. And all locales of the entity will have the same layout by default. So the creation of custom blocks within Layout Builder maintain their source language, hopefully, and using a reusable block will follow the block's entity reference pattern. So if translated, the block will show the correct language. This is going to answer a question somebody asked a little bit for layouts and paragraphs. Here, it's okay. I'm going to keep going. So Layout Builder Contrib provides two models for managing layout for overrides, and you can only choose one per the whole site. Okay, so you can choose asymmetric translations, which each locale can support localized content. This is localized, not just translated. But after the first translation from the source language, you've forked now your content. So there are challenges as you go through, like, oh, what if my source language changed and I want to get some of that translated text through my translation management system and back into my other locale? That's a little bit of that's different. It's a different workflow. And then symmetric translations, the pros is the source and translated locales are kept in sync, but the con is the display is, well, it's a pro con. The display is the same across all locales. So as you address what type of, are you using Layout Builder? Are you using Layout Builder with paragraphs? It's this, you have to take those same, insert the block concept with layout paragraphs. You know, you can use the same principles to approach your content architecture. So some considerations for asymmetrical. So the translated locales can look different. They fork off the source language. You can choose only one. And switching methods after the content exists may lead to content loss. Okay, and so as we're wrapping up, there's a lot of multilingual tooling efforts going on, so lots of testing. And I'm gonna just jump right into the questions here very quickly. So can you give me examples for content entity language display fallback rules? The person is only aware of site-wide fallback language. So if you go into the content language configuration area, you can define a fallback there. But yes, they have a site-wide default. And then you can go ahead, Christian.
Yeah, and there's also the language fallback country model, and you have your own hooks where you can have your custom solution. So I think that answers the question.
Yeah, and what do you suggest for layouts and paragraphs? Is layout paragraphs the way to go? These, I played with them a little bit, but I haven't used them in a real big site. I would say there is a big move to actually try to use those layout paragraphs together, but you'll run into the same problems for both of those solutions. And then if you have to choose asymmetrical and asymmetrical or combine the two, it might be interesting. So lots of test before you choose that solution. There's a question about field widgets that alter nested entity values. One of them is the module, the asymmetrical one for paragraphs, and another is inline entity form, like simple and complex. It's the one that's used a lot with commerce, and it's a nice little widget to edit inside. Edit a new node inside or a new entity. So that has to save the new or nested entity while your other form's open. So that's another widget. And Christian, Sarah asked a question about Lingotech. You want to talk about that one?
So Sarah was asking if Lingotech allows decoupling translations with asymmetrical translations. We do, but anytime you don't you support the scenario where that's configured, but anytime you don't load, you will be overwriting with the source structure. So we are looking at some way to lock the fields on the feature. Another question is about performance, how paragraphs with create a lot of database entries on every save. If the entity reference revision field is made translatable, will be an impact in terms of the performance. Well, this creates like a new revision for each language. So that's it's exponential. Like anytime you save a new revision, you will saving a new revision for each language that you have on your site. So
right, yeah. And we'll be posting the slides. There's a nice resource for entity references has gone wild by Jacob Perry that talks a lot about, and also your data model is terrible. It talks a lot about the performance impact of the entity reference revisions and thus paragraphs type of choice. So Tom asked, do you know any alternative to the multilingual asymmetric paragraph approach? Layout builder. But then if you chose, and like another person's question, if you chose layout paragraphs with layout builder, then you've got both the issues of both coming together. And also a lot of people, like this is coming from like Drupal 6 type of content structures. You'll use everything as a node, right? So you can come back to everything as a node type of, that's a model we see a lot. But it's a little bit dated because the node has a lot of overhead for performance instead of using a different content entity. So I think that's covering most questions. Does anybody have any other questions?
I think we answered everything.
Yeah, and we'll post this presentation up to the Drupal Note in a paragraph PDF format, and so you can take some time. That's why it's got a lot of text on the pages to read later, and then there's an appendix with some additional field information. So thank you very much, everyone, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.